How's it going, everybody? Hope everyone is well. My name is Jason. I'll be your host on this CFL talk show, Hussey's Huddle. In this video, we're going to rank all of the CFL teams by their Canadian talent. So excited to get started with today's video. But really quickly before we get started, if you want to support the channel, the best way to do it is by hitting the like button and subscribing to Hussey's Huddle for more CFL content just like this. It really helps me out, guys, and I really appreciate it. And with that said, let's go on with the video. So first of all, I just wanted to go over the criteria that I use to evaluate the Canadian talent on each CFL team. First and foremost, you need to have good Canadian offensive line talent. Year after year, historically in the CFL, it's shown that you cannot be a successful team if you don't have quality Canadian starting offensive linemen. It's really the backbone of any CFL team. The next factor I used was to look at if they had any impact Canadian skill players, so wide receiver, running back, or quarterback. Do they have any guy that really moves the needle in that regard? The third thing is I look for impact Canadian defensive player. I think that can make a huge difference. Obviously, I think I'd rather have like an impact receiver than an impact defender, just because I think offense is just more replicable week to week. I've talked about this in other videos I've done, but honestly, having a star defensive player makes a huge difference to a team's ratio situation in the CFL and really can make a big impact in the league. And if you have two of those guys, even better. The fourth thing is just overall depth behind those starters, projected starters that are going to be part of that team's ratio. And also, in addition, like any like special teams guys that I think are really notable that really add value to that team. I just wanted to include an all-inclusive category for that. So those are the four main categories that I use to evaluate the performance and the talent of the CFL teams. Now, without further ado, let's get on with the countdown. Starting off our countdown with the team that I think has the worst Canadian talent in the CFL in 2022, and that is the Montreal Alouettes. For me, when I look at the categories that I use to evaluate this list, where they really fall short is really the depth behind their guys that they are projected to start as Canadian starters next year. I think of guys like Chris Aki, who is one of the best Canadian defensive players in the league. He had a great season last year, but they don't really have anybody behind him. They don't really have any guy that has really shown anything really at the CFL level. And that's the case for a lot of their other positions, such as offensive line as well. I think they played much above their expectations last year, but a lot of these guys are a lot older, very experienced offensive line, but a lot of them are getting towards their mid-30s. So I think behind them, they don't really have a whole lot of, up-and-coming guys. You do have David Brown there, who's been all right for this team, but ultimately, that's really the downfall of this unit. But I think there are some good bright spots. The 7 guys that I have projected to start for them next year, and remember, teams can start more than 7, but very often it is the case that teams will only start the 7 Canadians that are required. For them, I have wide receiver Hergy Mayala. Pretty much every Canadian team, any CFL team, starts a Canadian receiver. So I think it's either going to be Hergy Mayala or Keon Julian Grant in that spot. Both pretty unproven guys. So they lose some marks for me in that regard as well. They don't really have that proven skill player guy. And then on the offensive line, I have 4 Canadian starters, the same 4 that started the majority of last season, and Christian Matt, Landon Rice, who had a surprisingly really good season last year for them, getting up there in age in his career, but had probably his best season of his CFL career last year. Philippe Gagnon played pretty decent for them last year, and then Sean Jameson, who has kicked in at center a lot of the time. So I think offensively, those are the 5 starters that they're going to have next season. And then on the defensive side, they just had the 2 linebacker Chris Aki, as I mentioned, one of the best Canadian defensive players in the league, in my opinion. Really good coverage ability from that linebacker spot, adds that physicality as well. Just a really unique body type there. And then at defensive back, I have safety Marc-Antoine Dequoy, who I thought was going to have an immediate impact last year. I thought he was going to start for them at safety, but ultimately he took a little bit to get going. But you started to see him in the lineup more and more as the season got along, always playing a role on special teams. He's a great athlete. But now with Ty Cranston gone, who left for Ottawa, I think that Marc-Antoine Dequoy starts next season. So I think those are your 7 projected starters for them next season. Coming in at number 8, we have the British Columbia Lions. I just kind of wanted to say that like that. For them, I think what really is their downfall and why they're so low on this list is really just one thing, and it's that offensive line talent. There's just not a lot of quality guys there. I think the best Canadian offensive lineman is really sadly Suk Chung, who has had very disappointing seasons back-to-back here from 2019 and this past season in 2021. He was a big free agent signing from Winnipeg, was a former All-Star in this league, and has really been disappointing since coming over here, being one of the highest paid offensive linemen in the league. When he's your best highlight of that unit from a Canadian perspective, it's not a good sign. I think this is actually the weakest Canadian offensive line group in the league, and with that being my number one weighted factor, that's pretty disappointing, I think, from that regard for the Lions. But there are a lot of talented Canadian players on this roster. Linebackers Bo Lacombo. I always get confused with the brothers, with Nelson now in Saskatchewan. But Bo Lacombo, reigning most outstanding Canadian in the league, and who saw that coming? Just an outstanding season from Lacombo last year. So he obviously is really adding value to this unit from my marking perspective. Also, you have Rookie of the Year Jordan Williams. So this is quite a tandem that they've built here in this linebacking core for BC. So those are really the two highlights of this Canadian unit for this team. But you also have, the other nominee from the East Division last year for most outstanding Canadian in David Menard, who I've been on record saying I don't think he's ever really going to have a season like that again. He had like 9 sacks on, he didn't even start a game for them last year. He was just a rotational guy. So I expect him to kind of come back down to earth last year, but I still think it's a solid addition for BC. And then, obviously, I think you got to talk about the Canadian quarterback room. It's very unproven with Michael O'Connor and Nathan Rourke. Nathan Rourke going to be the starter. But I think Rourke showed enough last season, plus the fact that quarterback's such an important position, give them a little boost there. And then wide receiver Javon Gatoy, who really has survived this very crowded Canadian wide receiver room the past couple seasons, and is now really the lone man remaining with Shaq Johnson and Lamar Durant out the door. So I think he has a lot of potential, and he could have a really big breakthrough season this year. So I think there's talent elsewhere on the roster other than that offensive line, but that offensive line, it just looks pretty shaky on paper, and it's going to be a big topic of discussion when we get to talking about team draft needs this offseason. I personally have 8 Canadians scheduled to start for BC next year, and I think that's because of the quarterback position. Obviously, quarterback Nathan Rourke is going to be starting for this team, but then Javon Gatoy, as I mentioned, is likely going to be their starter, Canadian starter at wide receiver. And then I think they're going to still start 3 Canadian offensive linemen to give them a little bit more flexibility with the ratio situation. So I think those guys are going to be David Neville, who has been a kind of an intriguing player the past couple years, and he hasn't really got a chance to be a starter yet. He has started a few games near the back half of the season when the Lions have fallen out of the playoffs, but I think he's finally going to get his shot this year. And then Suk Chung, as I mentioned, probably the best player in this unit from a Canadian perspective. And then Peter Godber, a former high draft pick. I think he was the 3rd overall pick a few years back, and has not really been very impressive at all at that center spot. So I think those are going to be the starters on offense for this team. And then on defense, as I mentioned, it's really the highlight of this unit. You got David Menard, and then the 2 star linebackers in Bo Lacombo and Jordan Williams. So I think those are going to be the 8 Canadians that are starting for BC day 1 next season. Now moving on to number 7, and this one may, I might get some hate in the comment section for this one, and that is the Saskatchewan Roughriders, who, again, I think it's a similar story, but to a lesser extent than the BC, what I just said about BC with the offensive line situation, because I just don't think there's very many, quality up-and-coming blue-chip prospects on this offensive line. You do have some solid veterans there, such as Dan Clark, who's getting up there in age, really solid center, but guys like Logan Furland and Evan Johnson, who was the big free agent signing they brought over from Ottawa last year, were kind of a little bit underwhelming last year. Logan Furland was kind of a surprise starter on that offensive line for me, but I don't think the interior of that offensive line was particularly impressive last year. So those are your 3 projected starters on the offensive line for Saskatchewan. But I think, just like BC, I think there's talent elsewhere from a Canadian perspective on this team, such as wide receiver Keon Schaefer-Baker, who is coming off an outstanding rookie season, really made an impact right away. I think he has the potential to be the best Canadian receiver in the CFL. That's how high I think his ceiling is. And then I do think they're going to start another Canadian at wide receiver as well, similar to what they did last season. You got Justin McGinnis, you got Mitchell Picton there. So I think one of those two guys ends up starting. McGinnis, they've been developing for a few years now. Offensively, they have some talent at the skill position, so they got a pretty good mark from me there. But then, on the defensive side, I think is where I have more of the questions. Saskatchewan's best Canadian defensive player, in my opinion, right now is Mike Edom at safety, who's coming off an injury-plagued season, and he's getting up there a bit in age, so you wonder how he's going to respond to that. But a pretty solid player when he's been healthy, and it was an all-star in 2019, so hopefully he gets back to that level. But aside from that, you got, an unproven guy who I think is going to start in Chabil DeBuyer, who's been kind of developing the last couple of years and has seen a good amount of snaps in terms of a rotational basis. So I think he's going to end up starting after the departure of McConnell Henry to the Edmonton Elks in free agency. So I think those are your 7 starters for Saskatchewan. And I think, again, what really drags them down is, one, the offensive line quality, who I think is better than BC's, and I think BC is probably by far the worst Canadian group in terms of the offensive line in the league, but I think Saskatchewan's probably the second worst. And then again, I have concerns on the defensive side of whether or not they have impact Canadian defensive player with Edom coming off that injury. So just to go over that again, because I was kind of all over the place during that last segment, the 7 Canadian starters I see for the Saskatchewan Roughriders day 1 in 2022. Wide receivers Keon Schaefer-Baker and Justin McGinnis. Offensive lineman Dan Clark, Logan Ferlin, Evan Johnson. And then defensive lineman Chabil DeBuyer and defensive back Mike Edom. Now coming in at number 6 on the list is a team that you may have expected to be last or right near the bottom of this list, and that is the Edmonton Elks. And I think what puts them above BC and Saskatchewan and to a lesser degree Montreal is the fact that they do have some quality offensive linemen, blue chip prospects on that offensive line from a Canadian perspective. And I'm sorry, I keep saying Canadian perspective. It's the first thing that comes to my mind. The Canadian talent on this offensive line is very good. You got David Beard, who up until last year I considered probably the best center in the CFL from his 2019 film. I took a little bit of a step back this year from what I've watched so far, but I think he's still one of the better, offensive linemen in terms of interior guys in the CFL. Then you bring in Mark Cordy, who was their star free agent addition, who played a lot of center last year for Ottawa. So it's going to be really interesting to see, do they move Beard? Do they move Cordy? Cordy has started at left tackle, by the way, in the past, but they did bring in Tony Washington from Montreal in a trade, so I think it's going to be really interesting to see what Edmonton does in terms of that offensive line shuffle, but they have the talent there, in my opinion. You have up-and-coming guys such as Thomas Jack Kodila, who was a 2020 first-round pick of this team, and ended up starting a few games towards the end of the year, I think the last 3 or 4 games of the season. So excited to see his development going forward, but you have that offensive line depth that you don't see with the bottom teams on this list, and I think time after time, again, like I said in the opening, you really do need to have that good Canadian offensive line talent and, quality. But, other than that, Edmonton doesn't really have too much special things going on here. You do have Mike Jones, who had a solid season for them last year at wide receiver, but I don't think he's necessarily a needle mover in terms of one of the best Canadian receivers in the league. And I think he'll be pushed in terms of competition. I think you have a good amount of depth here. You have Shai Ross, who's coming off a pretty good season last year. Pretty young player there. Tavon Smith, pretty much the same deal. Had a pretty good 2019 season with the team and was actually the starter for the majority of the year. And then really kind of lost his job towards the, going into the 2021 season. So, pretty good depth, and it's going to be really interesting training camp, competition between those 3 guys. And then on the defensive side, you bring in McConaughey, really solid interior defensive lineman. He's really going to stop the run. Provides a little bit in terms of upside as a pass rusher. Just not a lot of freak-like athleticism from there, but he is really, in terms of taking up space and commanding double teams on the middle of that defense. I think that's really going to be a big improvement for Edmonton this year. But they also lost Kwaku Boateng, defensive end, in free agency, who was arguably the best Canadian defensive lineman in the entire league. So, I don't know, that's going to be a pretty big loss. It's an interesting trade-off for this team. They're willing to take the loss on the edge to, improve the situation in the middle. And Henry, is a very consistent player. We'll see how it works out for Edmonton. And then aside from him, I think the other guy that's going to start from a Canadian perspective from the Edmonton Elks on defense is safety Jordan Hoover, who, has had some moments in the league. But I think that Edmonton secondary was, a little bit, shaky at times last year. Even though he did have his moments, I think he was targeted a lot of the time in that defense. So I'm excited to see what Hoover can do in his development going forward. And then outside of him, I think they do have some good depth behind a lot of these, positions that they're planning to start next year, such as Stephon Charles, who's been a guy that was in the NFL for a while, even got a lot of playing time in the NFL with the Buffalo Bills, but hasn't really done much since coming to the CFL as kind of a long-awaited guy that was kind of hyped up when he finally got to the CFL. We'll see if he contributes anything here. Last year's first-round pick Cole Nelson is also there. And then I think in the secondary, you have a collection of guys that hasn't really played, but you have a lot of, dart throws that Edmonton has placed here in the last couple of years, such as Eric Blake and Scott Hutter, that are, guys that they've, invested in playing time with the past couple of seasons and dressing them on game day. So I think there's a decent amount of depth behind a lot of these options, but I think that there's just not a lot of special outside of those, blue chip offensive linemen that I mentioned. I project their Canadian starters day one next year to be wide receiver Mike Jones, offensive linemen David Beard, Thomas Jack-Dardila, Mark Cordy, and Kyle Saxlid. And then on the defensive side, McConaughey and Jordan Hoover. Coming in at number 5, we have a team that improved a lot this offseason, and that is the Ottawa Redblacks. And I think in terms of their Canadian talent, they've made a lot of splashes this offseason. And I think the most important thing that they've really done is rebuild that offensive line. And I keep sounding like a broken record here, but offensive line is just so important in terms of this league. They had probably the worst offensive line in football last year, and that's saying something because these guys were pretty bad in terms of their offensive line at times last season. I think they've really tacked this weakness, and they've really brought in 3 guys that I think absolutely can be day one starters next year and be, give them a lot of quality in that offensive line as well. You have guard Jacob Ruby, who played really well in Edmonton before the whole vaccine scandal with him, misrepresenting his vaccination status. And then center Darius Sirocco, who they bring over from Hamilton, is going to be a really good piece for them on the inside, likely going to start there at center. But has played at the guard position as well, so he has that versatility. He's been a quality player at both spots. And then Hunter Stewart, a longtime BC Lion, who I think doesn't necessarily have the highest ceiling, but has been one of the better offensive linemen on a bad BC offensive line the past couple of seasons over there. But those 3 guys we know can play at the CFL level, have a ton of CFL experience between them, and they're going to really drastically improve this unit. It's the best offensive line unit we've seen on this list to this point in the video. At the skill positions, I think they're missing that guy that's really proven that he can do it on a consistent basis, but I think there's a lot of talent, and there's a good amount of depth that they brought in here. I think Nate Badhar is going to start for them this season. He did start for them last season and kind of had a breakout season of sorts for this team. And we'll see if he can repeat this with the competition they brought in free agency. Shaq Johnson, who started a lot in Vancouver with the BC Lions. And then Levi Noel from the Toronto Argonauts they bring in here, who's an excellent special teams player and may have more of an opportunity to, rise into a starting role here with the Red Blacks. But it doesn't just stop there for the Red Blacks. They have a ton of talent on the defensive side and really proven defensive players from a Canadian perspective. Defensive tackle Cleon Lang, who wasn't very noticeable last year, and that was kind of disappointing because even on a bad Toronto team in 2019, he was such an impact player. So I really expected the same thing to really show out when I watched a lot of Red Blacks games this year, but it just wasn't the case. But he's been a star player and a multi-time divisional all-star in this league before, one of the better Canadian players in the league if I had to pick today. And then they also bring in Kwaku Boateng on the defensive line to play that edge position, probably going to start for this team. He's probably the best Canadian defensive end in the league today. Has had a lot of production with the Edmonton Elks the past 4 seasons. And I think that, even though his production was down last season, I think he can have a really big rebound season next year in Ottawa. They also have a good mix of talent and depth in the secondary. You have Ty Cranston, who started the majority of the season last year at safety for Montreal. And then behind him, you have the veteran Antoine Pruneau, who I didn't like bringing back as the guaranteed starter for this team. But now that they brought in Cranston to really push him, I think that, maybe you light a fire under Pruneau and you get him to recapture some of that, ability that he had a few years ago when he was one of the best safeties in the CFL. But I think that's a really good combo, and with that competition, you'll get one of those guys, and you feel confident that you'll at least get pretty good, play from that spot, even if an injury happens there. And then behind him, you have Justin Howell, who has seen a lot of experience in the CFL in terms of, starting games on defense over the past couple seasons because the Red Blacks have been banged up and Antoine Pruneau has been injured a lot of the time for this team. What prevents Ottawa from being higher on the list for me is just the fact that there's just not that proven skill player that a lot of other teams have. So that's why it ranks lower for me. But I think other people would argue it to be higher, and I wouldn't, necessarily, totally disagree with it because they have those impact guys and multiple impact guys on the defensive side. So I think the guys that they're going to start next season are going to be wide receiver Nate Mahar, offensive lineman Jacob Ruby, Darius Sirocco, Hunter Stewart, and then on defense, Cleon Lang, Kwaku Boateng, and Ty Cranston. Now at number 4, we have the Hamilton Tiger Cats, and this is a team that I don't think has as good of an offensive line as Ottawa, but has made up for it in other spots by building at key positions elsewhere on their ratio. Offensive line, I'll always start with the offensive line. You have one of the best offensive linemen in the league in Brandon Revenberg, and there's no question about him. He's been, so consistent ever since they drafted him, and he's really just been the, dream of what you want when you select a player at the CFL draft. Probably the best guard in the entire league. Right tackle Chris Manziel has been one of the best offensive linemen in the league in the past decade and was the 2019 most outstanding offensive lineman in the CFL. But struggled a lot with injuries last year and really didn't get healthy until the final half of the season where, he really started playing at that high level again. He is getting up there, really high up there in age, and I think he's 38 years old. Great player, but you wonder when it's going to fall off physically. We'll see what happens with Van Zell going into next year, but, I think I give him the benefit of the doubt. I think he's still going to perform next year, but we'll see what happens. And then aside from him, I think you do have questions at the other spots. Holterwood Mancy, who actually ended up starting towards the back half of his rookie season in 2021. We'll see how his development goes going forward. Hasn't really been a proven player at this stage on that offensive line. They lost Darius Sirocco to the Ottawa Red Blacks in free agency, which is a big loss in my opinion. So we'll see if when Mancy moves over to center, or this other guy, Alex Fontana, who they signed from the Ottawa Red Blacks. Fontana didn't play last year. He opted out due to the COVID circumstances, but, we'll see if he can, recapture status as, an up-and-coming offensive lineman in this league. Never really got the chance to fully start because they had a guy named Alex Mateus, who was a really good starting center for Ottawa back in 2019. But Fontana, maybe finally gets his shot to, be that full-time CFL starter. Questions around him and Wood Mancy for me. And then you have number 2 overall pick from 2019, Jesse Gibbon, who started the season as a starter for this team, but, really was phased out of the lineup due to poor performance. And we'll see if he finally breaks through in year 3 for this team. But high expectations for this group in terms of, the guys that were drafted very high, but we'll see if they can, improve next season. At running back, you actually have quite a bit of talent here with Malik Irons and Sean Thomas Erlington, both having, varying degrees of usage through the first couple of seasons here in the CFL. Erlington has been a starter for this team for a while, but has been since supplanted by Don Jackson, so I don't expect Tiger Cats to start a Canadian running back next year. And then at wide receiver, I think, this is where you can have some questions about this team just because of, the health of Lamar Durant, the big free agent signing that they made from the BC Lions. Really missed a lot of last season due to injury, but back in 2019, he was probably the best Canadian receiver in the entire league, and had proven that, before that as well with the Calgary Stampeders. I believe he was most outstanding Canadian in the Grey Cup one year as well. So they bring him in, and that's a massive upgrade, I think, on what the Tiger Cats had there otherwise. David Unger has been a decent player, has made some good splashy plays like in the Labor Day Classic against Toronto last year, but hasn't really proven on a consistent basis. And then wide receiver Tyler Ternowski, who was, I think it was a third-round pick in 2020, was a rookie this past season. Unproven guy, we'll see what happens with him. But I think between those guys, you probably have one or two starters for this team, but we'll see what those guys, I think Durant obviously is going to start, but I think maybe one of those other two guys ends up starting for the Tiger Cats as well. So overall, the Canadian talent on offense for the Tiger Cats is pretty solid, not spectacular, but pretty solid. But what really boosts them up this list is the Canadian talent and star power that they have on defense. You have defensive tackle Ted Laurent, who may or may not start this year because they bring in Micah Johnson. They have Dylan Wynn there. Not too sure how that rotation is going to work, but Laurent has been a former All-Star in this league before and has just been, very important guy in terms of the Tiger Cats run defense, number one ranked run defense last year in the CFL. And then in the secondary, you have both high-end talent and depth here, with Tunde Adeleke being arguably the best Canadian defensive player in the entire league, in my opinion. He's really risen to that level. I think he is the best Canadian defensive back in the league and is one of the best Canadian players in the league, period. And then you also have sophomore Stavros Kasatonis, who is coming off a very surprisingly, good rookie season last year for the Tiger Cats. Got a lot of action for this team and, was robbed of a couple of interceptions, if I recall correctly, and even started in the Grey Cup for this team when Ted Laurent went down to a surprise injury. So I think there's a lot of talent there on the defensive side for the Tiger Cats, and I didn't even mention that they have Mason Bennett coming up as a guy that was their first round pick in 2020. He's coming off a rookie season. Could potentially be the, heir apparent to potentially starting on that defensive line one day for the Tiger Cats. I think it's possible that they do start him at defensive end for this team this year. But overall, I think, this team, in terms of their Canadian talent on offense, is just all right. And then on defense is really what makes them special. I think there's good depth pretty much everywhere except for, questions on that offensive line about proven guys. These are the guys I think are going to start for this team next year. You have wide receiver Lamar Durant, offensive lineman Alex Montana, Brandon Revenberg, Chris Van Zale, and Coulterwood Mancy. And then on defense, I have Ted Laurent and Tunde Adeleke. Hamilton could potentially start more than 7, and they also have the option of potentially rotating in Ted Laurent and not making him a starter, like I mentioned, and starting that second Canadian defensive back with Stavros Kasatonis. Now going into our top 3 with the Calgary Stampeders. And I think this team, when I went down to sit down to do this, came in a lot higher than expected, and I was kind of taken aback. I was like, wow, this team actually does have a lot of quality Canadian players. And I think on the offensive line, as I start again with the offensive line, Sean McEwen is one of the best offensive linemen in the league. He's right up there in terms of a discussion for the best center in the CFL, in my opinion, and was actually a CFL All-Star this season. And then you have Ryan Sevier, who's a really underrated offensive lineman at that right guard spot for this team. Just been really solid. Not a really flashy guy, but I think he really gets after it, especially in the screen game that Calgary likes to utilize. Zach Williams, I think, really matured a lot this season for this team. I think he's their third projected Canadian starter. And the way that they've developed offensive linemen in Calgary, the over the years has been really, really impressive. You also have Bryce Bell, who was their first round pick last season. He really stepped in there as a rookie and looked pretty good, honestly. So I think you have a really good, mix with those four guys. And then in the receiving core, I think there's not really a proven star, Canadian skill player. But I think there's a lot of talent here, and you have a good mix of guys that have, proven themselves and guys that I think really have that high ceiling potential, such as Luther Hukanavanu, who I think is going to be one of those guys that I'm probably going to do a video about with, breakout players for next season. Because I think this guy has just the athletic potential. Whenever this guy caught the ball, he made a big play last season. It just seemed like that was the case, and just the athleticism just like jumped off the charts for me. And then you have Colton Hunchak, a guy that hasn't really got enough playing time in this league, I think, for what he's shown in the limited sample size that he has got an opportunity. So I'm really excited to see what he can do now next season with Hergy Mayala out of the picture. I think he's more ideally kind of a slot guy because he's a smaller player. I think those two guys have a lot of potential. But then you also have the veteran Richie Sindani here, who may end up starting for this team. They really like just the comfort level they have with him. Just really solid guys, get to catch the ball. Really consistent hands, in my opinion. So, I think between those three guys, you're going to have some quality production from your Canadian guys in the receiving corps for Calgary. And then on the defensive side, I think there's a lot of interesting pieces, and I think it all comes back to Cameron Judge, their big, addition this offseason. They really didn't do anything in free agency, but they did make a trade before free agency, bringing in Cameron Judge from the Toronto Argonauts. And Cameron Judge, do we get 2019 Cameron Judge, where he was a nominee for most outstanding Canadian and was one of the best Canadian players in the entire league? Or do we get 2021 Cameron Judge, who, really, was in and out of the lineup, didn't really, consistently start for the Argos? I think I'm going to lean towards getting the 2019 version. I think Calgary really knows how to work with these linebackers, and I think, look at a guy like Darnell Sankey last year, first year in the CFL, leads the league in tackles. I think they're going to move Jameer Thurman from weak side linebacker to the middle, and then Cameron Judge can play that familiar weak side linebacker spot. And I think he's going to make an impact in that role. Behind him, you have DJ Lalama. I think that was a really good free agent addition, just under the radar kind of addition there for that team. So I think he's going to be really solid as a backup and backup plan when Cameron Judge potentially gets injured. And then on the defensive line, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what plays out here, because you have their high draft pick, Isaac Ademi Berglund, who's quickly coming on, and I think has that potential to be one of the better Canadian defensive linemen in the CFL and be one of these guys that starts on a regular basis. I think he has that athletic potential. But you have the veteran Derek Wigan, who's still going strong in the defensive tackle position. And so I think they have versatility to potentially start two Canadian defensive linemen if they need to and they feel like they want to on that defensive line this season, if they feel like Ademi Berglund has really earned that spot. So I think there's talent basically all over the place for this team. And I think the reason why it doesn't rank higher is just because they don't have that star skills position guy, where these other top two teams on this league, this list, do. So right now I have their Canadian starters as being Colton Hunchak, Luther Hukanavanu, offensive lineman Sean McEwen, Ryan Sevier, Zach Williams, defensive lineman Derek Wigan, and Cameron Judge. Now at number 2, we have the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and I think starting on the offensive line again, with Michael Couture, who I think is, a very, very underrated offensive lineman, who, again, is right in that discussion with David Beard, Sean McEwen as the best center in the CFL. I think he's just criminally underrated. Pat Neufeld is also a stud at the guard position for this team, a really, really good run blocker for this team. And then, they do lose Drew Delorier to the New England Patriots of the NFL. That's going to be a big loss because, this would be a 10 out of 10. I gave it a 9 out of 10 for this offensive line quality. It would have been a 10 out of 10 for sure if they had Delorier still there. And you have Jeff Gray, who's a guy that has started in the past for this team early in the 2019 season, if I recall, before Delorier really, emerged as a rookie. And I think Gray's going to do an adequate job, and they don't really have too much in terms of other guys that are, in the pipeline at that offensive line position, so that could be a spot that they really seek to target in the draft. They lose Liam Dobson, and this is a topic I haven't really talked about a lot on the channel, and that's the USFL. They lose Liam Dobson, the number one pick from last year, to the USFL draft. So, that's going to be a big hit to their pipeline in the future. But for right now, this is a really, really good offensive line unit from a Canadian perspective for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And then what really separates Winnipeg from a lot of other teams in the league from a Canadian talent perspective is the skill position talent. Just insane in terms of the depth and quality of players here. They do lose Andrew Harris to the Toronto Argonauts, and I think that's could be a big loss, and we'll talk about Harris more in a second. But they still have so much talent in terms of Canadian guys in this, skill position group. You have the running backs, Johnny Augustine, Verdi Oliveira. One of those two guys is going to end up starting next year and, taking the starting role from Andrew Harris, who, again, leaves to go to Toronto. And then you have Kyle Borsa, who's a really intriguing athlete who was selected in the draft last year. And could be a guy that, you see return kicks for this team or something like that. He's an outstanding athlete. I think he ran like a 4.3 40-yard dash, too. And then in the receiving core, you have Nick Dembski, arguably the best Canadian receiver in the league. Based on my top 15 wide receivers list, I do think he right now is the best Canadian receiver in the league. And then Drew Wolotarski, a really, really solid receiver that just does his job and occasionally comes up with a big play for this team. And, just been very consistent for this team overall. Yeah, Brandon O'Leary Orange as well, who was a 4th round pick, I think, in 2020, from Nevada. And we'll see if he comes and does anything in the future. But there's just so much talent at this receiver group and this running back group for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers that I have so much faith in this ability to, replace Andrew Harris going forward as, that star power leaves the lineup. So, moving on to the defensive side, I think it's a little weaker for this team, but you still have the impact player with defensive tackle Jake Thomas, who is the longest reigning member of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and just a really solid guy that everybody likes. Really good, stops the run and rushes the passer. Just a complete stud and, one of the more underrated Canadians in the entire league. Aside from them, they don't really have anybody with starting experience. You have a lot of guys in the pipeline that I think, could potentially, they've been developing for the last couple of years. Nick and Noah Hallett, the brothers in the secondary, it's going to be interesting to see if one of those guys ends up starting eventually. With some of these losses they've taken in the secondary over the past couple of seasons, it's going to be interesting to see if, they do start a Canadian out there at some point in the next couple of years. And then, in the linebacking core, Shane Gauthier is an interesting player who's really stood out on special teams for me. But I think outside of Jake Thomas, there isn't a ton there. This is really what cost them the number one spot on the list. But otherwise, offensively, this team is loaded from a Canadian perspective. So my projected Canadian starters for them for next year are Brady Oliveira, Nick Dembski, Drew Wolotarski, Michael Couture, Pat Neufeld, Jeff Gray, and Jake Thomas. Now, finally, we have arrived at number one. This is a long video, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize. There will be timestamps in the description. But at number one, we have the Toronto Argonauts. And this was a surprising thing for me because I did think they were going to land pretty high on this list, but I didn't think they would be number one. But when I just look all over this roster, there's so much Canadian talent and depth and guys that are young players that have potential to grow all over this roster. And so we'll start again with the offensive line with a guy like Peter Nicastro, who was a Rookie of the Year nominee last year from the East Division, lost out to Jordan Williams in the final vote, but a guy that started from day one last year and ended up having to move from guard to center and, excelled everywhere the Argos put him. And I think that was just a major reason why the Argos were able to, have a pretty good regular season last year, is because of that emergence of Peter Nicastro. And then you have Jamal Campbell, who's still a pretty young player, who they've kind of been developing over the past few years into this right tackle for this team. And he really struggled in 2019, not gonna lie at all. But in 2021, he was definitely not nearly as bad of a liability for this team and has a lot of potential as a run blocker as well, has a lot of good play strength for this team. So I think he's a really solid starter there. He's really starting to develop into one there. And then Philip Blake is a really, really good player when he's healthy for this team. He's just a really solid player, just has had an unfortunate bout with injuries over his career. And then what really secures this unit for me, because listening to what I have to say about those first three guys, you may not be totally impressed outside of Nicastro. You have so much proven depth behind him and guys that they've invested high draft picks in the past couple of seasons. You have Justin Lawrence, who comes over from the Calgary Stampeders, who could compete for a job this year. And especially with Blake's injury history, he may be able to overtake him for the starting job very early next season. You have Theron Churchill, who was a former first-round pick of this team. Shane Richards, who was a former #1 overall pick in 2019, who finally started to show a lot of potential last season when he finally got to start. I expect him to start at some point this season. Don't know when it's going to be, because I think he's really going to start peaking as a player, and I'm really excited to see what he does. And then, a guy that I forgot to mention was a starter because I for some reason, I mixed up the order writing on my sheet here. Darius Bladdock's probably the best offensive lineman in this unit other than Nicastro, and I'm really excited to see what he can do. They just made him one of the highest paid offensive linemen in the league, reported by 3 Down Nation. So excited to see what this unit does and who ends up starting, but there's just so much depth and talent here. I don't think the Argos can go wrong, and I think that's still going to be one of the most deep units in terms of offensive line talent in the CFL. And then in terms of their skill players, there's just so much talent here. You have Andrew Harris, who, say what you want about him. He's 35 years old, but, if he is 90% of the player that he once was, that's going to be a win for the Argos in terms of that signing. They don't really have a good Canadian backup behind him, but I don't think that this team, because they have so many different Canadians, they can start at so many different spots, that it's going to really matter too much. They can shift around the ratio quite easily, unlike a lot of other teams. And that wide receiver, I think you're starting 2 Canadian receivers with Curly Gittens Jr., who had an outstanding season last year. He's right up there in the conversation as best Canadian receiver in the league with guys like Nick Dembski. And then Jawan Brescison, who could be in that discussion as well, but this guy keeps getting injured almost every, couple games that he's been on the field. But he's an excellent player. Now, he scores a touchdown almost every game I see him play. But behind him, you have Dejon Brissett, former #2 overall pick, coming off a rookie season. Got into the lineup a little bit, but mostly a special teams role for him last year. But a good, athlete to have behind him to develop. So again, you have a good mix of impact skill players and depth in that spot with the 2 quality receivers there. And then on the defensive side, you have guys like Robbie Smith, who's not even going to start for this team at the defensive end spot, but he showed a lot of potential in 2019 and was a rotational guy for them this past season. At the linebacking core, you have the star, middle linebacker in Haynock Muamba, former most outstanding Canadian as recently as 2019. Maybe not the same player he was back in that day, but still an outstanding player. And, I think there was one game against the Tirecats. I think it was the last regular season game against the Tirecats. And he was just all over the field being a, tackling machine, so to speak. He's just an excellent player. And then, what really impresses me is this is a spot that I don't think they're going to start a Canadian at because of their, depth elsewhere. But the defensive backroom for this team has a lot of interesting players. You have Arjun Colquhoun, who has started games at corner in this league before. Royce Mechie, who I think absolutely could start for this team. He comes over for Cameron Judge in that trade. But he's coming off an injury, so it's possible that he doesn't start the season on time, and ultimately, they start Canadians elsewhere to start the season. But they give them that option to, flexibility to start another Canadian in that secondary. And then defensive back Mac Boateng, who's been an interesting, prospect that they've been developing the last couple of seasons, got a little bit of playing time here or there. But again, I'm just impressed by the depth of this team in terms of their starters. They have, an impact skill players. Actually, they have multiple impact skill players. If Andrew Harris is 90% again of what he once was, that's an impact skill player. Curly Gittens is an excellent receiver. They have the offensive line depth and talent, in my opinion. Blue chip prospects in that group with Peter Nicastro and potentially Shane Richards as well. And then, on the defensive side, you have the star linebacker in Haynock Muamba. So, in my opinion, this is the best Canadian group of talent in the entire CFL. And, that's my list for today, ladies and gentlemen. But with that said, that is going to be the end of this behemoth of a video on the channel. Probably going to be my longest video other than the live stream I did a couple of weeks ago on this channel. And, again, thank you so much for watching, everybody. Hope everyone enjoyed the list. Be sure to let me know what your own list would be down in the comment section. I really appreciate it. Remember to hit like and subscribe. Really appreciate it, everybody. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.